Hello and welcome to Continual. My name is Jean Marie Ward, and tonight, the convention that never ends is going to be talking about Interview with a Vampire, the vampire universe created by Anne Rice in all of its many forms: movies, television series, web series, comics, you name it. And we've got three wonderful writers and fans to talk about all this. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves and maybe tell us a little bit about their connection with the series, starting with Amanda.
So hello, I'm Amanda Meuwissen. I know that's not how my name looks, but that's how it's pronounced. Now, I am an MM or gay romance author. Been writing for probably over 10 years. And I still to this day say that the Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles were probably one of my biggest influences, even though I didn't write vampires myself for many years after other books. I always love telling my story, actually, of how I got involved with the Vampire Chronicles because it was through interview. It was through the movie when the movie came out, because I was 10 years old at the time. So I hadn't read the books yet, though I still did go on to read them, probably far younger than I should have. All because I loved all things vampires. And as soon as I saw the trailers for it, I was like, I need to see this. But it's rated R and I'm 10 years old. So my mom said no. At the time, of course, at Barnes and Noble, they had the books on the end caps as you go past. And of course, they're going to display the hardcovers. And I saw this $25 interview book and decided I was going to save up my allowance for 5 weeks. And then I was going to just buy it and say, haha, mom, now you can't stop me, which I tried to do. And instead, she put the book back and said, before you spend all of this money, I'll just rent you the movie and we'll see if you even like it, which I think probably set me on my entire path for what my career is now, because I've absolutely loved that movie. It's still one of my favorites to this day. And I went on to read the books as like a preteen, reading through all 5 of the original Chronicles at the time. And I've loved them ever since.
Great. Michael?
I'm Michael G. Williams. I write queer-themed horror, science fiction, and urban fantasy, including just a mess of stories that feature vampires. I've got a vampire series about a vampire in suburbia called the Withrow Chronicles, and I've written a lot of short stories that are about vampires in one way or another, vampires in Appalachia, that kind of fun stuff. And I came into like sort of the world of Interview with the Vampire in college. If I blanched when you said you were 10 when the movie came out, that's because I all of a sudden realized my own age and my own lack of immortality. But but when I was in college, I was a big nerd, and at my university, sort of the social scene for geeks were the computer labs. A lot of the computer labs were 24/7. A lot of times we were the people who kept them running at the same time as being the people who used them. So we were in them all the time. They were kind of where the party was all the time. So a woman that I knew from the computer labs one day said, are you going to be at the Anne Rice signing at this bookstore in the middle of town? And I said, who's that? And she said, oh, well, here's a book I think you would really, really enjoy. And I read that book. I basically devoured that book. And it's probably the fastest that I have ever read a novel. And I'm a reader and a writer and love to read. Just fell in love with the book completely. At the time, the only books out were Interview and Lestat. So I read those and then really just fell in love with the whole series. Eventually, of course, the movie did come out, and I was still in college when that happened, and I went to see it in the tiny little Appalachian town where I grew up. And a woman a few rows back from me spent the entire movie complaining loudly about the fact that all these guys talking to guys is not what I'm here for, etc. And so when the scene in the Louvre happened, she piped up, if they kiss, I swear I'm going to leave. And I said as loudly as I possibly could, for the love of God, kiss. So that's me, an Interview with the Vampire.
Hey, works for me, absolutely. Okay, Nancy.
I am Nancy E. Dunne, and I don't write vampire fiction yet. I actually have a piece in progress with a writer friend of mine. We've been co-writing it for about 6 months now, and it keeps getting really, really interesting and then getting pushed aside when other things come up. So I'm working on it. I was introduced to Interview with a Vampire by the first book. I was a junior, I think, in high school. And a friend of mine said, I think you might like this. And I was like, yeah, whatever. Took it home. And same thing as Michael, I took it home and I read it like that. I had never in my life read anything so fast, and just I couldn't stop reading it. My family did not, I don't know that they even knew. I mean, I was older than 10, so I was going to the mall on my own, and I was getting my books. And when Lestat came out, I was just thrilled, and I again poured through that one. When Queen of the Damned came out, same thing. I will admit that I did get a little burnt out, and I haven't followed Lestat through all of his princely
and
adventures.
metaphysical journeys that connect with obscure sects of Catholicism.
I did not quite make it that far, but there was a time when I could just about quote for you at least the first 3 novels. I was very much in love with Armand. The whole 9 yards. The movie came out. I remember going to see it at midnight the night before it released, when I was in college in Knoxville, Tennessee, and just about had the very same experience that you did. There were some people in the theater behind me and my date that were like, what is, but that's Tom Cruise. What's Brad Pitt doing? And I was like, because I knew what they were doing. I knew it was coming. But it's always been one of my very, very favorite vampire novels. I think now you could probably class it along with the paranormal romance, but I don't see it that way. I see it as such a groundbreaking piece that I even worked in a bookstore, and I would fight them when they wanted to put those books on the same shelf with like J.R. Ward and some of these others, which are great in their own respect, but this one is just so different that I was like, no, let's don't put that under what we lovingly called kissy bitey. It's got to have it like its own shelf.
Yeah.
So that's,
no, exactly. I agree. I'm sorry.
no, that's fine. That's me. Mostly high
okay.
fantasy, a little bit of lit RPG, and some weirdly steampunk adjacent novels, but no vampires yet.
In my imagination, we had that experience at the same time, just across the state line from each other, because I was watching it just outside Asheville.
Yeah, so probably.
I love it. I love that so much.
You probably left your theater and drove up to Knoxville and went, man.
You realize
maybe if we go see it in Tennessee, it'll be different.
The entertaining aspect of this, as somebody who's probably older than everybody here, is the fact that this is a conflict that has been happening ever since Bela Lugosi put the moves on Dwight Fry in the original 1931 Dracula, because Carl Laemmle said, you can't have him biting another guy. And it's like, what? Dudes, how are they going to feed? Really?
But Bram Stoker kind of baked that into the mold,
Yeah, he did. And if you go back to the legends beyond Stoker, these are revenants. They will eat whatever's available. They don't care. They just don't care. But anyway, Nancy, is the book still your touchstone, or have you found that the other media that Interview has taken on speak to you more these days?
I feel like when the first one came out, the Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise movie, I went into it expecting to hate it, and I did not hate it. I loved it, which was saying something, because to this day I won't see a movie if it's got Tom Cruise in it, because I personally think he's a little bit of a wackadoodle who plays himself in every role that he plays. I just saw something different when he played Lestat. Now, at I guess a different point in my own life, and having read them over and over and over, I think I would go back to the book if somebody asked me what I thought was like the essence of Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Chronicles. I would have to say the books, although I have very much enjoyed most of the TV series. There are some things that are able to be shown now that kind of give me the willies a little bit. Like I'm a person who, when I have animals in my fantasy novels, they're all magical animals, so they can't die because I can't do that. So I will admit, I've gotten up to the point in interview where they bring Louis something to eat and it's an obviously CGI'd animal, but it just bugged me and I had to turn that off for a little bit and come back to it later.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that goes back to the books being my Vampire Chronicles, because I can just skip over those parts in my head if they really bother me, but it's hard to skip them when they're, in Technicolor right in front of you.
This is true. This is true. I will say that I also thought that Tom Cruise would, the idea of having Brad Pitt as Louis, the dark and beautiful, and Tom Cruise as Lestat, the 6-foot+ blonde, really offended by sensibilities. And then I saw the movie, and Brad Pitt was a loser as Louis, but Tom Cruise was like, oh my God, he can act.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
For once, playing himself was.
Yeah, it just worked.
That was it.
And so it was just brilliant. Okay, Amanda, what is your touchstone now in the vampire series? Is it the books? Is it a particular book? Is it the movies, the series, the other media?
If I'm comparing interview to interview, or interview to interview to interview, I have to say now, I guess. Obviously, I'm going to be colored by the fact that I saw the movie first. And I actually then read 2 through 5 and then went back and read the first book when I was probably a older teenager. So it was so different to me than what the movie was. And to this day, I just still prefer the movie. There's things I don't like as gorgeous as Antonio Banderas is, and as much as I love him, that's not Armand. So that will always stick with me as the thing that's like, oh, I love you, but you're just not right.
Why didn't they have him playing Louis?
Well, but I wouldn't have wanted that accent for Louis. I don't think he could have done any kind of accent that would have worked for Louis, though. But I get what you're saying there. But yeah, so for that, I mean, I still love everything else about it, though. And it's like, there's certain aspects of the book that if I, go back and reread it, I skip over because I'm like, well, you could have cut that. And hey, they did in the movie, like things that don't gel for me. But reading the rest of the, 2 through 5, the original Chronicles, it's like, that's when Lestat is Lestat. Like, that's when you actually get to know him because she realized she liked his character better, right? And switched gears and we got to actually learn who he was. So interview to interview, it's the movie for me. But if I take the series as a whole, nothing can beat the series because of how Lestat's personality. And me personally, I've often heard a lot of people say that their favorite book in the original 5 books is Queen, which I do really love. But for me, it's Memnoch. Memnoch the Devil is in like my top 5 books of all time. Like, I just love it. It hits me somewhere. So I still, for me, it does come back to the books, except for interview.
What about, the metaphysics? A lot of people, as we got past Queen, we're looking at it going, this is kind of weird. And of course, my husband, who studied late antique and early medieval history and knows all about really, really weird Catholic sects, heresies, and metaphysics, is going, I was reading in passages going, this sounds like what you're studying. And he's going, yeah. So did you have a problem with that? Or did it add to the experience?
I mean, maybe it was because too, I was going at it so young. Like, I was a teen, 12 when I started with Lestat. Lestat was a bit of a slog, I remember, for me. Like, his early human years was hard for me to get through. I think it took me a year to slowly read that book. So I was definitely a teenager by the time I was reading the rest, but still really young to be diving into this. And anything else I was reading would have been way more middle grade, like totally different, that I don't think it even dawned on me. And I'm was raised Catholic, so I think I loved that. It's kind of like loving the movie Dogma, because it hits so hard in those places. You just love it more somehow, because it's like, that's how, I grew up with some of this mythology. So then it's fun to see different twists and takes on that kind of stuff. So I just loved it. Like, I remember looking back and hearing that a lot of people didn't love Tale of the Body Thief, and I still absolutely loved it. And again, Memnoch's my favorite because I liked that exploration. And it's, to this day, like you were saying, Nancy, that you could probably have quoted 1 through 3 easy. Like the first like few lines and the last lines of Memnock, I still have memorized because I think there's it's the best opening and ending to any book I've ever read. Like it's just so Lestat embodied that yeah. So none of that stuff really threw me. I think I really loved it, but I was also again, 10-year-old who was watching X-Files and all those other, anything scary or weird. Like I was like, yeah, give me all the weird.
Mm-hmm. Michael, what about you? What is your touchstone? Book,
I think
movies?
that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to list them all.
Okay. Oh no, I could list them all.
Yeah.
It's tough for me to say. This might not be a very popular answer with anybody, but I think that if you had asked me 2 years ago, for instance, I would have said, well, the first book, and specifically the print version of the first book. I've also listened to the audiobook. It's beautifully narrated, and I am a huge fan of the 90s movie, and thought at the time, I also went in thinking this is going to be garbage. But I had also, right before I went to see it, had seen an interview with Anne Rice where she had said, I thought it was going to be garbage and it's actually really good. So I went in willing to assume the possibility that it would not be garbage, but pretty much assuming it would be garbage, and then was very impressed with it and really loved it. But I think if you asked me today, which just did, I'm going to say the AMC TV adaptation, because it is so good. And it touches on so many of the same themes in such a fascinating way. And Anne Rice was very heavily involved in developing it before she died. It's not something that got made in her absence because she wasn't around to tell them not to do it anymore. This was a version of the story that she had decided she wanted to tell. And authorial intent, I don't really necessarily think has to carry a ton of weight. We were talking beforehand and you mentioned that half of the story is what people bring to it, and I think it might even be something more like 90% of the experience of a story is what people bring to it. So I'm not saying that because she had blessed it that it's necessarily better, or that it has to be blessed by her for it to be good, but I think that it is an example of a storyteller having evolved, and so their story grows and evolves as well. The stories that they tell grow and evolve. I think that I love it because it shows us a New Orleans that is not just like relentlessly white. And whereas the movies are pretty relentlessly white, like there are a handful of people of color and they are the victims in everything. They're never the powerful people. They are never the people with power. Whereas I feel like the AMC adaptation, it takes all the same themes, queerness and feeling like you're in danger all the time, and feeling like you're disconnected from the world around you that you're supposed to be a part of, and the disconnect between family and the expectations that we have for life and what ends up happening, and all the different things that the books are about, and rapid changes in society and what it's like to live long enough to see change for which one was unprepared, which is a huge, very subtle theme about aging in these books. One of my favorite things about a good vampire story is that ultimately it's about getting older, even though it's about immortals. And an interview with that whole series, but Interview with the Vampire especially, is very much about getting older and not really being prepared for that experience. Because I think ultimately a lot of vampire stories are about the way that we all are still 25 in the back of our head. And we're continually surprised to find out that the rest of us has kept going past that point. But the TV show is about all of those things that the books are about. And it updates it so that it can do some more interesting stuff with the settings. And it updates it so that it can talk about some more explicit iterations of those same themes of being marginalized, of being ostracized, of being an outsider looking in, of the tension between being a wealthy and powerful person of color in New Orleans, which is a city of people of color, except that at the time it was run by white people. The fact that it gets to talk about all of these things, the queerness, the racism, the misogyny, the ageism, you name it, the economic disparities, everything is there. Every possible angle of entry into the story, every way that its themes connect to the real world is present in that TV show. And it's a TV show that includes our current unpleasantness, is how I will phrase it. And very few shows acknowledge that part of our reality. And as a result of that, it is very difficult for me now to watch and enjoy things that were made after the beginning of our current unpleasantness and feel like they happen in a world that I have access to. So the fact that the current unpleasantness is happening in the TV show at the beginning, I feel like is a fantastic way for me to feel connected to that world in a way that a horror story might normally not be accessible to somebody emotionally.
Well, with vampire stories do frequently intersect with plague narratives.
Yes.
And frequently, you will see this intersection with epidemic, pandemic, etc., such as we're seeing now. One of the things that I think is interesting about the AMC, and yeah, I was saying Netflix, my bad.
Oh, didn't even realize.
Yeah, just came out, But one of the things that I found interesting about it was not so much the intersection with the pandemic, which I think is a very valid point. I got caught on some historical details that were incorrect. And, like, no, that's not what, no, that right now in this time period, no. And I'm a pedant. I apologize right off the bat. But one of the things I found interesting was that it was very much a marrying of the themes of the Vampire Chronicles and the Feast of All Saints, which is one of Anne Rice's historical novels. It was like, oh, this is their love child. And I liked that. I just wish that they had done a better job of integrating the history of free people of color and their complicated history into what they were putting on the screen, which it just didn't gel for me because in a past writing life, I had to research that rather extensively, and it was like, so I was squeaking on it. But Nancy, have you watched the series, and what's your takeaway on it?
I have started it. I wanted to wait until there were a lot of the episodes released because I've become a binge watcher and I can't watch things that I don't have at least 2 episodes to watch in an evening. So I was waiting. And then there was that scene that I mentioned before about Louis being brought his meal, and that just sort of put me off for a little while. But honestly, that's the kind of thing that I was hoping would be included in that. I feel like the movie was beautiful, and it was very French provincial, and it was just, the camera angles and all the lighting and everything was just gorgeous.
And the lace.
Then the lace, but I really wanted the TV show to find that gritty part that I had found in the books. That was kind of the behind the scenes, behind all the lace cuffs and the goblets full of blood. I wanted to see that too. And I feel like they did it. I feel like it might be a little more than my Southern sensibilities are ready to quite handle. I'm going to go back and watch the whole thing when I can watch it all as one and not just be left with, a fox on a plate and be like, ah. But I do appreciate the fact that not just that the story can be updated to maybe be a slightly more realistic portrayal of New Orleans at that time period, but also some of there wasn't that much CGI, there weren't that many weird special effects, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how some things are done. Like Claudia, for example, always bugged me. I'll bring out another unpopular opinion and say that she was never my favorite character. That always bothered me. I don't have human children of my own, but it still just rubbed me the wrong way. And part of it, I think now, as an older person looking back, is her age. And I know why Anne Rice wrote her into that story. I know who she was supposed to represent, but I feel like the slightly older Claudia in the television show may resonate a little better. Because the point is, the eternal child that never, talk about being on the outside looking in, never being able to, your brain is experiencing an adult life, but your body is not. And I just feel like it might resonate a little better with a slightly older Claudia. I don't think they aged her up that much. I think she's 13 or 14, but I mean, at that point in New Orleans, that was Marian age in all the United States, not just New Orleans. So you can see her as an adult, but our modern sensibilities will still see her as a child, very much a child. So that I'm looking forward to seeing if that softens Claudia a little bit for me, because
Yeah, it always
never one of
sounded.
my favorites.
I know it was about Anne Rice's, the daughter who died.
Mhm.
I know she was trying to show the grotesque sin that this was, and Louis's desperation for connection, and Lestat's desire to have him all to himself. But it always struck me as the ultimate child abuse. I just, yeah, Squick City. Amanda, have you had a chance to dive into the series as well?
Yes, I finished it quite a bit ago now, though I was late to the party because I was very late to the party as far as when it released, because I was very hesitant. I think I waited till 4 episodes were up before I started. And which is what I want to ask. So Nancy, do you know what number you're on? Do you know what episode that was? I need to know that. Because I can't remember when that moment is when they bring him through.
It's either 2 or 3.
Only 2 or 3. No, because Claudia's not introduced until.
No, I read it. I read ahead.
Oh.
And I know, who was playing Claudia, but that's why I said I'm looking forward
to
seeing.
Do we want to avoid spoilers?
I think you can go up to 4.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, there's things I'm going to have to infer, but that I can hold back.
Please don't do that just for me, because I have so many friends who have so many feelings that they've already basically told me everything.
I start there because it's 8, right? It's 8 episodes total. Not wrong.
I think so, yeah.
Because I want to echo, I think it's 8. But Michael, everything you said, like, yes, I could echo all of the great things that you were trying to say about this TV series if you stop at episode 4. All the clout it built for me there, where I was like, oh my God, this is actually really good. I'm loving how they're set. I love the cast, love the reason they cast them and when they said it and why. Like, it totally drew me in. It was like getting to fall in love with it all over again, but as something new, like fan fiction of itself, to be kind of tongue-in-cheek funny about the whole thing, really. But I really loved it. Claudia was tough for me, partially because I think she's a great actress. I'd be interested to know from a Southern perspective, but my husband grew up in Louisiana, and neither of us could stand her accent. I did not think she did a very good accent, and acting wise, she's fantastic, but she didn't sell it for me. Louis is great. I think he does a fantastic job. But so that was one of those things where the back of my brain kept kind of tuning her out because I couldn't take her seriously. But for me, the biggest faults of the last half are how boring it is. It just, for me, was so boring. I found myself looking at my watch and going, why is it putting all this filler? Nothing's happening. They're just sitting around and it's not really saying anything. Like, you're wasting all this space in these episodes. So much could be happening. And then finally stuff happens in like the very last episode. But it just, I love the first half and loathe with a fiery hot passion the second half. Like, I really hated it. But for me, so to try to, not just for you, Nancy, but to not spoil things for anyone, really. Like, for me, I was really, really offended with how they chose to portray that second half of Louis and Lestat's relationship. Like, I thought it was really gross and didn't make sense to me, because more so in what they're going to do with it later. Because one thing I always loved about the books is, for me, Louis and Lestat are both unreliable narrators. Louis was telling his version of the story, and then Lestat came in and said, well, actually, I'm so much cooler than he tried to portray me, and way better than that, and here's how you know what I mean? Like, and neither of them are probably getting everything exactly right, like, I like that it put that across. And I do think the TV series was maybe trying to hint at that too. Like, there was a lot in the last few episodes where you're like, yeah, Louis definitely not telling the whole story here, which I appreciated. And other possible guesses about future stuff. But the way they portrayed Lestat was so unforgivable that there's no way they could ever tell his side, at least to me. And that turned me off, because I want to love both of them while still recognizing their faults. Not to try to say Lestat is not an abusive partner, but the way they chose to do it went too far for me. They went so far, he can't come back from that. And so for me, it makes me not want to watch more, because I don't really care about what would happen after that. So it kind of left me in limbo. I still really love the first 4 episodes and would want, recommend to any fan of the books to give it a shot. And then I'd be really curious what a lot of them thought. I've just been really surprised by there being a fair amount of love for it, because there were a lot of things that really didn't sit well with me in that second half.
At Con Carolina, somebody brought up the entire franchise, Interview with the Vampire, and I referred to it as a romance. And the answer I got, like the response that person had, was, it's not a romance. It's not supposed to be romantic. And I was like, of course it's a romance. And their answer was, but they're horrible. And I
romance
said,
can be
have you
negative
met?
too, yeah.
I said, have you met couples? Come on. Like,
Yeah.
oh my God. Yeah. Yeah, they're horrible. It's a horror novel. It's for me. Okay. For me. And part of what I love about the TV show is that it's a horror novel that has a really strong romantic element to it. It's a horror romance, but I put horror first, in the way that I read the book and in watching the TV show. And in watching the 90s movie, I would call it a romance that had horror elements. And there's I'm neither of those for me is a judgmental phrasing. That's just what I think is the strongest element. It's part of why I love the movie, because the movie was such a romantic movie. But for me, the book, the TV show reflects the fact that it's a horror story. These are monsters. These happen to be monsters who do it, and it's really fun that they do it. And I'm really happy that we get to see a lot of that in the TV show. And they're monsters,
Yeah, there is when you've got Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise looking better than he ever looked in his life, and Antonio Banderas at the height of gorgeousness, however his accent works, and no, he's not Armand. And I say this as a redhead, but when you've got those guys swanning around the stage, it's really easy to overlook the horror elements. And yet, yeah, with the books, all of the books, there is that really, when Tom Cruise lifts his bloody mouth from somebody's wrist, he's still Tom Cruise under the blood. And you don't necessarily get that in the books. You get, this is horrific. And, so I can see that. But not having made it to the last 4, I can't say whether or not, it is boring. I just, I will confess, I looked at the guy they had playing Tom Cruise. Boy, is that a Freudian slip. Yeah. Playing Lestat and going, you're trying to play Tom Cruise instead of trying to play Lestat, which is my other.
See, I don't think so. Cause I really like him too. And I like getting to hear a French accent for once, I love both of them. And I think they're both just as gorgeous.
Oh God, they're gorgeous. Yeah. It's just that it struck me as you're not playing Lestat. You're a generation removed. It's like what they told us not to do when we transitioned from fan fiction to writing fiction, of you are no longer writing Adrian Paul playing the Highlander. You are writing your character, not some other writer's words. And
it's
I
interesting.
got that feeling.
It's interesting that you brought up that scene where he lifts his mouth up off the wrist and it's Tom Cruise covered in blood. I think Lestat, for me, that lives in my memory from reading the books, is somewhere between that and the scene in the church in the TV series, where he does turn around at some point and he's got blood on his mouth. And I just remember pausing it for a second and going, well, that's not Tom Cruise. Okay, let's keep going. I mean, just, it was just an interesting, and you just saying that brought that back up into my head, that juxtaposition of those two images of two interpretations of Lestat. I don't think either one of them is really what I see in my head.
But yeah, we bringing it back, the 90%, as you said, Michael, we're bringing everything that we have on those books and to all these media. And yeah, definitely.
I mean, I didn't like Armand in the movie.
I liked him because he was Antonio Banderas.
I love Antonio Banderas, but all of the, he just, I don't know.
Oh God, yeah, no, it looked nothing like the book, and he acted like nothing like the book. And oh my God, who wrote this? And oh, it was probably to make sure that Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise looked better. Okay, yeah, got it.
My take watching it when I was watching the movie, that I remember very distinctly thinking, I really hope that he's not like 14, because that's gonna get real bad. That's gonna push some really bad stereotypes. These are not tropes that I need the rest of the people in this theater to go home having had affirmed for them. And so that's what made me feel like
I always heard. That's what I heard was why they cast into it. Well, they still could have cast a redhead or something, right? But why they chose to cast someone older was to avoid that sort of trope. But like, they still could have cast a young 20-something redhead. But
yeah, there was on one of the books, there was a picture. They used a Renaissance painting of one of these gorgeous boys that were, the object of all desire in the Renaissance, that were about 15 or 16. And there are a lot of young actors who were in their 20s. But yeah, that's the other aspect that, is the undercurrent, the negative undercurrent of these. I mean, to a certain extent, I think that the whole Anne Rice corpus normalized the idea that love is love. They help normalize it in popular culture. But on the flip side of that, Armand in the books and Claudia also raised some of the specters that have been used to whip, LGBTQIA community, though really that was never the intent. And to a certain extent, I was glad that they cast somebody older likewise, because I did not want that to muck up things, muck up the good stuff. I mean, in the books, it's easier to understand because you get more nuance, you get more discussion. And, one of the things I liked about the Lestat's transition was that, yes, he was brought in somewhat against his will, but he was an adult and he made a decision. So even in the depths of it, he had agency. I'm not entirely sure Louis ever had agency, but then again, he was also an adult, and there are a hell of a lot of relationships like that. So, but that's just my view. And God, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
For me, in the books, I feel like it was in some ways her attempting to demonstrate that idea of these creatures live so long that the world that they come from is not the world that we meet them in. That they are literally embodying the ways that times have changed. But at the same time, oh gosh, that doesn't make it fun to read in the now.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. My brain is remembering Armand being 17.
I don't remember how old he is.
I just remember. I mean, we're still young from our.
In my head, he is just classed as a kid.
Yes, underage by how. But again, if you think back from he's from, 500 years old at that point in the story, then would it have meant as much when he was that age?
Yeah, and 15 was adulthood in the barbarian kingdoms. Clovis came to kingship at 15. That was the year that basically you no longer required a regent. Though some regents tried to hold on. You were considered capable of making your own decisions. the Romans had a higher standard of adulthood. You couldn't serve in the Senate until you were 35, for example, and something else couldn't happen until, I think you couldn't inherit fully until you were 25, because they were big on the idea of age. But yeah, during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it was 15 was pretty much the age. So yeah, the fun and games of having a historian for a husband. So how has one thing I probably am going to throw the cat in the hen house, or the fox in the hen house. Forget the dead fox; it's a very live one. Does anybody remember the Stuart Townsend Lestat?
Oh yeah.
So that's the Queen of the Damned one. And actually, I watched it recently because I have a great story about this one too, just because I was excited about it since the time. I think it was my favorite book. I would have read Ben Nuck by then, but it didn't play at my local theater because I was in a small town. I'm in Minnesota. So my mom drove us up to Fargo, North Dakota, because we're quite close there, so we could go see it.
Yeah.
And I remember her response afterwards was, "That was the most beautiful man I've ever seen," just because he's so sleek, in that one. My husband barely remembered it. Like, he remembered watching it a long time ago, but like that album for our age, like when we were teenagers, in the early 2000s. So it's like all the music in it, the way they transformed it from something that would have been in the 80s, all that hair metal type stuff that would have been actually the way Lestat is in the book, to then making it a 2000s kind of genre. It's such a great time capsule of the music of the time, the goth culture of the time, my teenage years, that I love it by itself. Like, I love it as long as I separate it from the book as its own entity. It's not a good movie, but I like the time capsule that it creates. Like, it was a lot of fun to go back, and the soundtrack's fantastic if you like that type of music. But I mean, talk about something that is not even remotely close to, because one thing I loved about Queen was how you got to see all these different perspectives, like even characters that didn't matter, right? Like these side characters that you'd never met before, you got to experience what vampirism was like for them. And so like, I hated missing out on that, and I hated no Louis. Obviously, it was like, what the hell are you doing? Like, thanks, let's shoehorn Jesse in there and make a MF romance out of this that makes no sense whatsoever. But I'll always have a special place in my heart for it, because it is a weird little time capsule and is still fun. But yeah, Stuart Townsend is not Lestat, but Aaliyah did a great job as being Akasha. So
yes, I really liked Aaliyah, but yeah, it was just like, yeah. I think your squeeze, Charlize Theron would have done a better Louis.
I mean, I think
height.
with that movie, I read the book and I loved it. The first 3 I just devoured. But when it got to that movie, the way that it plays out in my head now, and I've seen it like, I don't even know how many times, but it's like those book trailers that people make now that just have clips of things that aren't really, it's just like their idea of what their character looks like when they're doing things. Like, I have these memories of Lestat on stage singing, and I'm like, yeah, okay. And Aaliyah was amazing, and that was totally spot on, I thought. But I don't even see that in my little mind montage of that movie, because that's what it is to me. It's just like little flashes of what it might be like to live in Anne Rice's universe, but not really. You're absolutely right that it's a total time capsule. That's when I was, fresh. I wasn't fresh out of college. I was out of college, considerably out of college, and being my own little Gen X self, living in my little apartment and doing my little thing. And that was the kind of music that I was still listening to. And so I think I have a connection to it through that. But yeah, you're right. It is its own little thing, and it's lovely. Stuart Townsend is absolutely lovely, not Lestat, but lovely. Yeah.
See, I'd say actually, I think too, if I were to ever say I'd love to see something, I would love to see a Queen of the Damned remake, movie where it's set in the 80s and it actually is Lestat as that version of the rock star. Like, I would love to see that. I think that would be so fun. But
yeah. it would bring out that part of Lestat that I don't think a lot of people think of when they think of Interview with the Vampire. They think of the monstrous side, and they think of the, swanning around in the lace cuffs and all this, but they don't think of how absolutely hilarious some of the things, that some of the interplay between Louis and Lestat. I found it funny. I mean, some people might think that was creepy or weird or flirting or whatever, but there was a lot of it that I was like, he's a fantastic character.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I think that those books have so many levels and so much richness. And I mean, Rice's work overall has a great deal of richness and depth, or I don't think it would resonate with so many people. So, Michael, thoughts on this one outlier of a movie?
I mean, I really enjoyed it. I don't know that it's a great translation of the book, but I also don't think that that's a book that can be translated to film very effectively. I think that's actually true of a lot of these books. I think that my husband and I, literally 10 minutes before this panel, were talking about the fact that so many people's objections to the AMC version, or even to the 90s TV, to the 90s movie version of Interview, is what they want is the experience of the book presented visually. And I just don't think that that's possible. I don't actually think it's really possible to translate one medium to another directly like that. I think at best, in the best adaptations, what you get, well, they're adaptations, they're not representations, but the best adaptations are ones that, hit on the right themes and show you the right moments from the text, but don't attempt to be just a literal, like somebody reading the book aloud to you while the visuals happen kind of experience. But which I think is what a lot of people want. I think what a lot of people want out of an adaptation is they want the emotional satisfaction and experience, and that sort of like joyful sort of astonishment of encountering the story for the first time. But they want that in a form that they can sit down on the couch and watch instead of read. And I just don't think that that's really possible. So at the same time, there probably were better ways to adapt that book into a film. But I really enjoyed it. I don't know. I'm a person who I like liking things. And so when I watch it, I think, yeah, there's probably a lot of stuff that I would do very differently. But also, Aaliyah is really great. I feel like maybe it's worth enduring parts of it in order to get that. I just feel like there's a lot there to work with. And I don't think that it's fair to the books to expect that, or to the TV shows or movies, to expect that they be perfect direct translations. There's just like a movie of the book would be, I don't know, like 17 hours long, something like that. Like, it would be wild.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I want to sit through that.
Well,
I think,
yeah, that's what series like The Interview with the Vampire is about. You get the 17 hours, but split up in acceptable chunks. An hour and a half to 2 hours, 8 times. And even that, as we've discussed, yeah, it's an adaptation. The one good thing you can be sure of in this case is that every time there's an adaptation, Anne Rice got a check.
That's
and
true.
Speaking as
That's
a writer, that's critical.
Yeah, what is that even like?
I think it's a consummation devoutly to be wished.
Yes.
Let us just use that terminology. Okay.
Absolutely.
We're coming, and this has gone quite quickly. We're coming up against sort of the end of the hour, but I do, this is a work that grabbed all of you, grabbed all of you by the shoulders and shook you in many ways, in many levels. So as for the final question, before we talk about your work again and where folks can find you, how did Interview with a Vampire intersect, inform, affect, change the way you wrote? Michael.
Gosh, I mean, so the first published books I wrote were a 5-book vampire series, and it was very heavily influenced by every form of Interview with the Vampire that existed at the time I started writing those. And in some ways it informed them as something that I was steering away from, but in some ways it informed them as something I was steering towards, because I was writing a series about a vampire who is not conventionally attractive, who lives in the suburbs. He's not super rich. He doesn't have, you know, a bunch of twinks chasing him around. And but he did have a lot of the same themes that are present in those. He is somebody who is marginalized. He is somebody who feels very disconnected from the world of the living, somebody who very much felt like an outsider looking in, and assumes that that's always going to be the case. And so a lot of those sorts of thematic elements definitely like stuck in my brain for 10 or 15 years after reading the first book and started percolating. It also, watching or reading the books, got me interested in the tabletop role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade. I'm a big gamer, and I spent years playing in an ongoing storytelling chronicle with friends of Vampire the Masquerade. And obviously Vampire the Masquerade was heavily, if you're a gamer, then it's obvious that it was heavily influenced by Interview with the Vampire, to the point that, you know, Anne Rice and White Wolf had to sue each other repeatedly just to make sure that everybody's copyrights were being respected, you know, with no malice between any of them, as I understand it. Just this is what lawyers said they had to do, you know. So there's obviously a lot there that influenced Vampire the Masquerade, and then the experience of playing vampires in role-playing games heavily influenced my writing of vampires, and sort of was my strongest intro to being able to attempt to think like that sort of character. So it really, really shaped a lot of it. It also told me right out of the gate that it was possible for me to write books about the queer experience and have people who were not necessarily themselves part of queer communities, or did not identify as the same parts of the queer communities, because the queer communities are many different identities and experiences. I love the word queer. It's my favorite word in the English language, because it's this big tent, and it's basically saying, like, if you've ever been told that you're not doing it right, welcome to the club. So, and I feel like anybody who finds themselves in the queer communities is able to find something in those stories, but also people outside of the queer communities are able to find things in those stories. And that was a real surprise to me, you know, as a kid growing up in a remote place and coming of age at, you know, the very early 90s, and heading off to college and discovering that places with lots of learning were just as queerphobic as any place else. Then it was a real surprise to me. It was a real wake-up call of, yeah, actually queer stories can be told and people can really dig in and enjoy them. And that made me a lot bolder with my choices as a writer after that.
Cool. Amanda, okay. How did Interview with the Vampire influence, affect, inform, intersect with your writing?
Well, for me, like I said, since I was so young, we're talking when I was first starting to learn how to write. And two big things that led me to, where at the times, this was, you know, mid 90s, chat rooms and stuff was everywhere, right? And what did all of us kids do that we shouldn't have? Pretended to be older than we were so that we could talk with adults and get in on things, right? And of course I did. I don't remember how old I said I was, but I definitely lied. And I was actually part of like an RP group for the Vampire Chronicles. And I'm sure everybody else was at least older teens, if not 20s. What's really cool, actually, is I found that one of my fellow MM authors, even though they're from North Carolina and I'm from Minnesota, we were in that same chat together, and it was not a big group. Like, we discovered this after meeting in person, and it was like, oh my God, like the heavens opened up and decided to bring us together as friends. And did we just become best friends? That kind of moment. But that was the first time I was really starting to write collaboratively. Even at such a young age, it's like you're, you know, RPing is such a great practice. Same with how I actually, my first experience with fan fiction was ironically Anne Rice fan fiction. It was much, you know, it was very hard to find, right? You know, using web crawler and whatever else during the day to, you know, to find those. But like that's too, you know, going to starting with fan fiction also sort of taught me how to write and taught me how to read different variations on how people wrote different types of stories. But then as I got older and started actually, you know, writing my own original works, I think what I still always take away from Anne Rice's chronicles and any of her writing that I've read is the characters that I really fall in love with, both as a writer, like my own characters, and, you know, as a reader, are the really nicely flawed ones. Like, we can love to hate them at times and still love them. And they just become so real. They feel like a part of your own psyche. Like they're, but I mean, like a friend in the back of your head, you know, like someone who's really there. And that's what causes you to get so sucked into those books, is Lestat and the other characters all feel so real. And for me, if I can take anything away from that, and any of those moments when people have told me how much they love a particular character of mine or got sucked into a book for those reasons, that's what I want. That's what I can hope for, coming off these books, because they just, yeah, captured that so much for me. It wasn't until much later that I realized I'd also found my queer community. You know, not until I was, you know, late teens, didn't even realize how much that was meaning to me as a young kid, and how I was forming this stuff without even realizing it. And like, oh, I was actually, you know, in love with a lot of my friends growing up and didn't actually realize that that's what was going on, because everyone told me I wasn't supposed to do that. Like, going back and being able to recognize that meant a lot, especially when I looked back at some of my early writing when I was like 12, 13, and then left it alone and found it as like a 17, 18-year-old. And I'm like, oh, these are queer characters. And I didn't even I'm trying to write a straight romance here, and there is no chemistry between these characters at all. This is the romance. What's wrong with me? Because I thought that's what I was supposed to do, but I had subconsciously put on the page what was really supposed to be there. So all those things, even the things that took me a while to realize, you know, I owe a lot to that. And I don't know if I would have known to go there, or so I had that awakening in myself, if not for interview and everything that came after.
Okay. Nancy, I know that you have not yet published a vampire story, but just because it's not the same subgenre of speculative fiction or fantasy, doesn't mean that interview didn't affect what you wrote, how you wrote it, all of those things. So could you talk about that? How the story, the movie, the TV show, even though a little bit less than your dive into the other ones, how it influenced, and the Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles as a whole, how they influenced, affected, informed, intersected with your writing?
A lot of my writing has been informed by me being a gamer, both an online gamer and a couple of little forays into tabletop that I never found the right group until just now. I'm actually playing this Saturday with my group, and I'm so happy. I can't stand it. But I read all of the Vampire the Masquerade books, anything I could get my hands on, because I didn't have a group to play with. Went to one live action one and ended up being assigned Nosferatu, which just really made me mad. I was like, whatever, I'm gonna go sit in the sewer and sulk. But all of that has given me the reminders and the ability, I think, to remember the world building as you are focusing on the characters, whether they're vampires or not, to remember the parts of that influence your characters and the parts that don't influence your characters that you can get rid of, things like that. And the writing collaboratively that as well was good practice. But I think more than just the Vampire Chronicles influencing my writing, Anne Rice did, because a lot of my writing now, I have found, includes, instead of writing a bunch of prequels, I have flashbacks that I feel like I handle pretty well, or one character telling another character a story, which I can point directly to interview and go, that's where I figured out how to do that. And like you said, very unreliable narrator, but part of the fun for me as a writer is letting the other characters suss out which parts are true and which parts are not, especially characters that were not in that first, in it when it was happening. So I like putting my characters in the role of the interviewer, so to speak, from Interviewer the Vampire. But just the layers that she had in her writing, and the things that, you know, after I've read this book a million times, I can go back and go, oh, what was that? Wait a minute. And mark another thing in my book that I didn't see the first time. Just, it reminds me to not limit myself. That's what editors are for. That's what drafts are for. Just to go ahead, if I feel like I want to describe something, honestly, when I can think how she would have described something in a book. Now it's more influenced by how it looked in the movies, because, you know, I have that image in my mind now. But just things like that, I feel like that series, more than a lot of others, influenced my actual writing style and my craft. It also led me to a lot of other vampire books that were sometimes as good, sometimes not as good. The Historian, very good. Discovery of Witches, pretty good. Some of the Kissy Bitey books from the bookstore, so good. But it's all still, it's taught me to research whatever character I'm trying to write, to look at different perspectives. And she's got so many characters in the Vampire Chronicles that you can pick and choose whatever vampire it is you're trying to write, or whatever, you know, wizard you're trying to write, or whatever your character happens to be. You can find somebody that has that little bit of something that you want and read like a whole character bio in a novel, and then use that later in your writing. So I'm a huge Anne Rice fan. I mean, y'all, I just about shut down when we lost her. I was just like, what's happening? No. So I think it was more her than specifically the books, but the books definitely were a huge influence. And I did the online chat room thing, but it was on Prodigy a million years ago when I was a kid. Not a kid, I was in my first job, but that doesn't matter. But yeah.
You were an infant. You were an infant. You're all infants.
Sure.
But anyway, I believe the Mayfair Witches, has that series started yet? Or I know it's been filmed. So yeah.
I think it started.
Yeah, I think the first season ran already.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
I
didn't hear anybody talk about it, I feel.
Yeah, that's
maybe they were afraid to, after all of the about interview. Maybe they were like, I'm just going to watch this and be quiet.
Well, I think that, you know, a lot of I mean, I had issues with interview, but the things that people were bitching about, the fact that it was, you know, bringing in the diversity that was New Orleans, bringing in the stuff that she had formerly only addressed in her historical fiction, I was totally cool with that. Why are they getting upset with that?
Yeah.
But yeah, people are weird.
It was
And not
nice
in
to
a
not
good
just
way.
it was nice to not just get a version of the movie again. Like that would have been
Yes.
boring, right? That wouldn't have been interesting. Like I was all on board to see it go a totally different direction.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's why I got mad at at the guy playing Lestat, is I took one look at him going, could you have found an actor who looked more like Tom Cruise if you tried?
At least he's tall.
Shoo! Anyway, but we could go on, I'm sure, and talk more about other aspects of Anne Rice and other aspects of these books, but unfortunately our time is over. So I'm going to ask everybody to, again, tell me about their latest book and where folks can find you on the web, starting with you, Nancy.
I am at nancyedunne.com. All of my stuff is also available on the Zon. I have the epic fantasy series, the Rana Chronicles. Gee, how did she influence me? I have an lit RPG-esque, portal fantasy-esque novel, and I have that steampunk adjacent one, but all of it is available on my, information is on my website, and they're all available through Amazon.
Okay, and the website?
nancyedunne.com, because I am not creative, and I would forget it if it wasn't my name.
Yeah, I know that feeling. I'd forget it. Oh my God. Amanda.
Also amandameuwissen.com, but it is the easiest way. If you Google me, I am the only one that exists. I'm the only one in the United States. So I will come up if you Google my name. And you can easily find all my stuff. All of it's on Amazon and across other sites as well. My newest release was actually an audiobook version of one of my biggest sellers of last year, Gardening with a Ghost. I actually did a really cool project with the narrators where we do it almost like a radio play. One person does the narrative. Each dialogue piece is by the same person throughout for specific characters. So really cool. Though I will also mention my most recent vampire book was last Halloween, and it was an romance adaptation of Dracula called A Delicious Descent, which is probably one of my favorite things I've ever written because it was a dream come true. As much as I'm an Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles fan, I'm also a big Dracula fan. So please check those out. But yes, amandameuwissen.com will lead you to every possible place you could find me.
Great. Okay, Michael.
My website is michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. let's see. My most recent book is part of a series of time travel urban fantasy books that I have set in San Francisco called Shut the Gates of Mercy. And all of my books are, information about all of my books are on my website.
And Shut the Gates of Mercy, isn't that your Emperor Norton series?
Yes, that's the third book in my Emperor Norton series. And the soon to come out fourth and final book called The Last Scene of a Strange Career will happen soon.
Yes,
Love
it
that
was.
title.
Yes. And it was a strange career, both in life and in your afterlife for him.
Indeed.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you all. This has been a great panel. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it too. And I hope you folks out there in Continual Land enjoyed it. Will join us again next time here at Continual.